October 1943. The ground of Italy still trembled beneath the Allied boots. After months of relentless advance since the invasion of Sicily, British and American forces had finally taken Naples, a city ravaged by war, suffocated by famine and German occupation. It seemed like a victory, but it was only the beginning of a nightmare. When the Allied generals looked north, they expected to find a retreating, weakened enemy. But no, what they saw was a wall. Not of concrete, but of stone, snow, and death. It was the Gustav Line. The Gustav Line was not just an ordinary defensive position. It was a masterpiece of German war engineering created by the hardened hands of Eastern Front veterans, led by the legendary Field Marshal. Albert Kesselring. It cut across Italy from coast to coast, like a scar on the nation's body. Mines buried underground. Barbed wire coiled like venomous snakes, machine guns hidden in caves carved into the rock, everything meticulously designed to transform every enemy, advance into a bloodbath. And at the center of it all, Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was a 516-meter high mountain that stood like a silent sentinel over the Rapido River valley. At its summit was a 1,000-year-old monastery, founded by St. Benedict in the 6th century, a place of peace now besieged by the fury of war. The monastery resembled a castle from ancient times, made of thick stone overlooking all the southern routes. Whoever controlled Monte Cassino controlled the route to Rome. The Germans knew this, and they turned that mountainous region into a living hell as Allied troops climbed muddy slopes, braving constant rain and biting winds. Nazi defenders dug trenches, buried mines, and set ambushes at every bend in the road. It was like climbing a mountain made of thorns, watched by unseen eyes with trigger-happy fingers. Every step of the Allies was punished by bursts of MG-42s, precision artillery, and sniper fire hidden among the ruins and trees. The advance that once seemed inevitable stalled. The troops were trapped. The road to Rome was blocked. Morale was beginning to crumble. It was like fighting an invisible enemy, clinging to the rocks, fused to the terrain. The soldiers slept wet, with rats biting their feet, and woke to the screams of the wounded echoing through the valley. The nightmare had just begun. Monte Cassino, until then a symbol of faith and contemplation, was about to become the stage for one of the bloodiest, most destructive and controversial battles of World War II. The mountain would burn, and the world would never forget the name Cassino. Want more epic and bloody World War II stories? Subscribe now and don't miss a single chapter of this saga. Faced with the deadly stalemate of the Gustav Line, the Allied generals began to grasp the true scale of the challenge, and it all revolved around a single point: Monte Cassino. That mountain, which before seemed just another elevation on the road to Rome, now revealed itself as the beating heart of the German resistance in Italy. Imagine trying to cross a valley under heavy fire, knowing that from above, hundreds of meters above, the enemy's eyes were watching every move. Nothing escaped. No patrol, no supply truck, no infantry advance. Everything was seen and everything was hit. Monte Cassino's geographic position was perfect. South of the mountain, the town of Cassino, already devastated by sporadic bombardments, was surrounded by treacherous rivers, steep hills, and dense forests. For those climbing, it was a logistical nightmare. For those defending, it was a strategic paradise. At the top, imposing, was the monastery of Monte Cassino, a massive stone structure with high, thick walls built to withstand centuries, not modern artillery. There, the symbol of the Christian faith seemed to watch with stony eyes, the horror unfolding below. The Allies saw the monastery as a potential fortress, an ideal observation post. But there was a dilemma. Were the Germans really inside? The truth at that moment was bitter. The Germans, led by the fearsome Wehrmacht paratrooper division, the Fallschirmjäger, had spun a deadly web around the mountain. They hid in caves, concrete fortifications, hand-dug bunkers, and among the rubble. but surprisingly did not occupy the monastery itself, at least not yet. Even so, the mere fact that the monastery dominated the entire battlefield made it a constant nightmare in the minds of Allied commanders. Soldiers at the WWII front muttered, "They're in there. They're watching us. They're aiming for us." The troops' morale plummeted. The rain was incessant, the terrain a mixture of mud and blood, and every tree seemed to hide a rifle ready to fire. Monte Cassino wasn't just a mountain, it was a curse, a place where time seemed frozen, where life was measured in minutes, and where every meter gained cost dozens of bodies. And as the soldiers awaited further orders, looking up at the mist-shrouded summit, the certainty grew in everyone's hearts. Monte Cassino would have to fall, at any cost, and the cost would be incalculable. The year turned, but hell continued. In January 17, 1944, the British took the first step towards the abyss. It was the first Battle of Monte Cassino, the beginning of a series of brutal offensives that would forever mark the Italian campaign. The plan seemed simple on paper, like so many others. Attack from multiple flanks, forcing the Germans to divide their forces and finally break. Through the Gustav Line, through the Rapido River valley. But the paper doesn't bleed. The valley was a trap. Ahead, the 10th British Corps, composed of English, Indian, and New Zealand soldiers. They would advance toward the mountains. On the other side, American troops would cross the Rapido River, trying to penetrate the heart of the enemy line. But what awaited them was not a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse. From the very first steps of the offensive, the British realized the scale of the problem. The terrain was treacherous, drenched in rain. The slopes were covered in mines camouflaged under leaves and mud, with every step a crash. Legs flew, shattered bodies disappeared into muddy craters, and then came the fire. German machine guns embedded in the hillsides fired in continuous bursts, cutting down entire ranks of soldiers like scythes through a wheat field. There was no shelter. Artillery rained down overhead and to the sides, as if the gods were unleashing their fury on every man who dared climb that damned mountain. Meanwhile, in the hills, the soldiers, Indianos and Gurkhas, warriors feared and respected for their ferocity, climbed near vertical cliffs amidst storms and grenades. Still, they advanced, one step at a time. Chests open, kukri knife in hand, but each advance was paid for with dozens of lives. The Germans, embedded in their positions like ghosts in the rocks, seemed omnipresent. Where no one was visible, there they were, shooting, waiting, killing. The hope of a rapid advance became an illusion. Troops were exhausted, ammunition was scarce, and bodies were piling up. Radios begged for evacuation. The valley became a swamp of screams and blood. In the end, what was supposed to be a lightning offensive turned into days of fighting stopped, very high casualties, and no real progress. The first attempt to break Monte Cassino had failed, but the Allies did not know, or did not want to know, that the worst was yet to come. If this battle has you hooked, just imagine what's to come. Click subscribe and join our community of true history buffs. On the night of January 20th, 1944, under a heavy, cloud-covered sky, the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, composed mostly of soldiers from Texas, was ordered cross the Rapido River, break through the German defenses and open a breach in the central sector of the Gustav Line. The problem? Everything. The Rapido wasn't just a river, it was a natural trap. Its banks were flooded by constant rain. The ground was pure silt, and the Germans had turned every meter of it into a deadly minefield. Furthermore, the entire length of the river was under direct fire from enemy machine guns and artillery, positioned on high, camouflaged vantage points. But the order came from above, and orders in war are not discussed. The first inflatable boats were launched into the water during the early hours of the morning, men shivering with cold, praying softly, their faces covered in mud and fear. When they reached the middle of the river, hell broke loose. Beams from German searchlights illuminated the dark water, and immediately a rain of fire fell on the soldiers' machine guns, fired like chainsaws. Boats were torn apart like paper. Soldiers drowned, were shot through, or simply disappeared into the current. Those who managed to reach the other bank had no trenches or shelter. They found only more mud, mines and barbed wire, and the Germans were waiting for them there, in ambush, with grenades and rifles. Ready. Those who didn't die immediately were trapped, fired upon from all sides, without reinforcements, without ammunition. In 2 days of fighting, the 36th Division lost more than 2,000 men, dead, injured, or missing. 2,000 in a single move. An attack that never had a chance of success. A useless sacrifice orchestrated by generals desperate for results. Surviving soldiers spoke in whispers with empty eyes. It was suicide. No one should have crossed that river. The bodies floated for days. The Rapido became a river of blood. The offensive was finally called off, too late, and while the Americans counted their dead, the Germans remained there, intact, steadfast. Monte Cassino remained invincible. February 9th, 1944. A new offensive, new men, new hopes, and the same horrors. This time, leadership fell on the shoulders of the troops, Indian and New Zealand, fighting under the command of British the 8th Army. Among them were the legendary Gurkhas du Nepal, short, silent soldiers, and as feared as hungry lions. They carried the kukri, the curved knife that, according to legend, was never drawn without seeing blood. The plan was audacious. Climb the steep cliffs around the monastery, where the Germans were believed to be fortifying positions. Allied troops wanted to bypass the direct defenses, climb up the flanks and take the summit by surprise. But nothing in Cassino came easy. The Gurkhas began their ascent in the pre-dawn darkness. Without light, without artillery support, their hands clutching wet rocks and roots. They advanced like shadows, silent predators. The terrain was nearly vertical. The rain made every step a risk of a fatal fall. And yet, they went up. When the sun rose, the impossible had been done. The Gurkhas were on the slopes near the summit. Their breathing was heavy, their muscles trembling. But what they found up there wasn't victory, it was hell. The German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were waiting. They had already turned every rock, every tree, every fallen wall into a nest of death. Machine guns opened fire in short, precise bursts. Grenades rolled like stones. Vegetation burst into flames. And the Gurkhas, they fought with ancient ferocity. With war cries piercing the air, they attacked hand to hand, in rapid ambushes using the kukri in deadly silence. The Germans retreated and returned. It was a bloody dance on the bones of the mountain. Further down, the New Zealanders tried to fight their way through the destroyed town of Cassino. Streets were torn apart, buildings reduced to concrete skeletons, mines buried everywhere. Every corner hid death. The fighting turned a war from house to house, wall to wall. But even with all the courage, even with all the sacrifice, the Allies failed to break through. The losses were heavy. The hillsides became cemeteries. The Gurkhas, even though they fought like ghosts of war, were forced to retreat. The top still belonged to the Germans. Monte Cassino remained impenetrable. And on the horizon, a dark decision began to form. If the monastery was the symbol of resistance, perhaps it was time to destroy it. History is more than dates and facts. It's emotion, blood, and courage. Sign up to experience every battle with us. The monastery of Monte Cassino, imposing, serene, almost ethereal amidst the chaos, remained intact. Its white stone walls, built in the 6th century by St. Benedict, withstood the test of time. And now, also, the war. Built as a haven of peace, high on the mountain, it was never intended as a military outpost. It was a place of prayer, of silence, until the arrival of war. To the Allied soldiers, the building seemed omniscient. It stood at the highest point in the region, and anyone standing there could see everything: troop movements, convoys, attacks. Even though there were no weapons inside, and at that moment, in fact, there was no The monastery was a perfect observation point, and that's where the conflict began that split faith in half. The Germans swore that the monastery was not militarily occupied. Red Cross reports confirmed this, and the Benedictine monks who still lived there continued to pray amid the echoes of the bombings. It was a symbol of European faith in ruins, but still standing. However, on the Allied side, the pressure was growing. The soldiers said, "We're being watched from up there. They're targeting us from above. Every step we take ends in crossfire. That's no longer a monastery. It's a fortress." The generals were divided. Many hesitated. Should they bomb a sacred site that had stood for over 1,400 years? That had survived the fall of the Roman Empire, the plague, the religious wars, and now would be destroyed by Allied hands. The Vatican intervened. Representatives of the Pope pleaded for the monastery to be spared. The Archbishop of Canterbury also spoke out. But the men in the field, those who buried their comrades day after day, no longer cared about cathedrals. They wanted to survive. And then, General Americano Mark Clark and the Air Command made the decision. Cold, irrevocable. If that monastery isn't used by the Germans now, it will be soon. Let's destroy it. The divine hammer of war was about to fall upon one of the oldest houses of God on earth. The next day, more than 250 bombers began to warm up the engines. Did you like this video? Then don't miss out. Subscribe and receive more stories that will help you relive the greatest moments of the war. The destruction of the Monastery of Monte Cassino, the tragedy at the heart of the Gustav Line. The Battle of Monte Cassino was not an isolated event, but the culmination and most brutal moment of a long and bloody Allied campaign to break through the Gustav Line, the most formidable of the German defensive lines in Italy. At the center of this line, like a crown on a mountain, stood the ancient Abbey of Monte Cassino, a symbol of Western culture and faith, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century. Its destruction on February 15, 1944, would become one of the most controversial and tragic acts of World War II. The context, a bloody stalemate. By early 1944, the Allied advance in Italy had stalled. After the successful invasion of Sicily and the southern peninsula, American, British, New Zealand, Indian, Polish, and other forces faced a nearly insurmountable obstacle, the Gustav Line. Designed by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the line took advantage of the region's mountainous terrain and rivers to create a series of interconnected defensive positions, difficult to attack and easy to defend. The key point on this line was the town of Cassino, and above it, the mountain that dominated the Liri River Valley, the most direct route to Rome. At the top of this mountain, 520 meters above sea level, stood the monastery. To the Allied soldiers fighting and dying in the muddy, icy valley below, the Abbey seemed a silent, omnipotent observer. They firmly believed the Germans were using it as an artillery observation post, from where their every move was monitored and punished with precise, deadly fire. Frustration and fear transformed the monastery into a symbol of enemy resistance. The controversy and the fatal decision. The decision to bomb the monastery was not taken lightly. There was immense pressure from battlefield commanders, especially from New Zealand General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Corps. His troops were suffering terrible casualties, and he refused to order a new attack while the Abbey remained intact, considering it a military necessity to be neutralized. However, senior commanders, such as General Mark Clark of the US Fifth Army, were skeptical. Reconnaissance flights showed no clear evidence of German troops within the monastery walls. Kesselring himself had ordered his troops to maintain a distance of 300 meters from the Abbey walls, declaring it a neutral zone to preserve its historical and religious value. Indeed, two German officers, Lieutenant Colonel Julius Schlegel and Captain Maximilian Becker, had worked tirelessly before the battle to evacuate the monastery's priceless treasures, manuscripts, works of art, and relics to the safety of the Vatican, saving a priceless heritage. Despite this, the pressure of the troops on the front line prevailed. The logic was brutal. Even if the Germans weren't there now, they could occupy it at any moment. The mere existence of the building as a potential fortress was too great a threat. General Harold Alexander, the Allied commander-in-chief in Italy, relented and gave the fateful order, describing it as a regrettable military necessity. Leaflets were dropped over the area warning civilians and monks of the impending attack, but many were unable or unwilling to leave, believing the sanctity of the site would protect them. February 15th, 1944, hell falls from the sky. The sky of February 15th, 1944 was still grey when the first rumblings appeared on the horizon. The sound grew louder, like the harbinger of a storm, but it wasn't rain that was approaching. It was a squadron of more than 250 Allied heavy bombers, including B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, arriving from airfields in Italy and North Africa, their target, the heart of the mountain. At 9:28 a.m., the first plane dropped its payload. A 500-pound bomb streaked across the sky and struck the monastery roof with a dull boom, as if the earth itself had screamed. Within seconds, the bombardment intensified, becoming a symphony of destruction. Hell fell from the sky. For 4 hours, the attack continued in relentless waves. Heavy bombs, with unimaginable destructive power, tore through the monastery like waste paper. Millennial marble columns, which had withstood earthquakes, invasions, and time itself, were pulverized. Renaissance frescoes, ancient manuscripts that could not be evacuated, sacred relics, all turned to dust and flames. The few monks who still lived there ran in despair through the collapsing corridors. Hundreds of Italian civilians who had sought refuge within the sacred walls, believing themselves to be in the safest place in Italy, were crushed under tons of stone. They were not soldiers. They were old people, women, children, ordinary people whose faith had become their death sentence. The ground shook for miles. When the last plane had gone, what remained of the monastery was a smoldering skeleton, a pile of smoking ruins, surrounded by debris, screams, and the silence of death. The immediate consequence: a disastrous tactical error. The attack was a disaster, military and moral, because ironically, the Germans weren't inside the monastery at the time of the attack. They had respected it until then. With the building now in ruins, the elite paratroopers of the 1st German Parachute Division, Fallschirmjäger, some of the most tenacious and experienced soldiers in the German army, saw a perfect tactical opportunity. Immediately after the bombardment ceased, they occupied the ruins and transformed them into a natural fortress, far more effective than the intact monastery could ever have been. The shattered stones and collapsed walls became perfect trenches and machine gun positions. Destroyed corridors and underground crypts became tunnels and artillery-proof shelters. The collapsed columns, now piled high, served as impenetrable barricades. It was impossible for the attackers to tell where the rock ended, and the soldier began. The Allies had done exactly what the Germans expected. They destroyed the sacred and handed them a new castle, shaped by chaos. And so, the ruins of the monastery, a symbol of European spirituality and knowledge, became Italy's most cruel battlefield. Faith had been buried under rubble, and in its place sprang only war. Monte Cassino did not fall. Monte Cassino armed itself. The battle for the mountain and valley would continue for another 3 months, demanding 3 more. Major offensives and the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides. The next attack would be even more ferocious, fought amid the rubble the Allies themselves had created. Do you want to understand the true face of war? Subscribe to the channel and embark on epic journeys, real stories, and plenty of action. Third battle, the rubble becomes a fortress. March 15th, 1944. After the failure of the first 2 attempts to break through the Gustav Line, frustration within the Allied command was palpable. Thousands of lives had been lost, and the advance toward Rome remained blocked by the same mountain and the same stubborn defenders. The decision was made. The next offensive, the Third Battle of Monte Cassino, would be an overwhelming display of brute force. The strategy was simple and terrifying: pulverize the German positions with unprecedented firepower, transforming the city of Cassino and the mountain slopes into a lunar landscape where no living thing could resist. Operation Dickens, the Firestorm. March 15th, 1944 dawned with a deceptive calm. Exactly 1 month after the controversial bombing of the monastery, the sky trembled again. It was the beginning of Operation Dickens. This time, the Allies decided to break the Germans through sheer firepower. There would be no subtlety, no mercy. Beginning at 8:30 a.m., a colossal air fleet of 775 bombers, British, American and South African, began a saturation bombing raid. Over 3.5 hours, they dropped 1,250 tons of high explosives on the city of Cassino and its surroundings, an area of just over a square kilometer. The bombardment was so fierce and concentrated that the ground itself cracked. The houses, churches and streets of Cassino disappeared, literally wiped off the map. The sound was deafening, and the continuous explosions shook the ground like an endless earthquake, raising a cloud of dust and smoke that blotted out the sun. Immediately after the last plane departed, Allied artillery opened fire. Nearly 1,000 guns of all calibers unleashed another 2,500 tons of shells over the next few hours, stirring up the newly created rubble. The intention was to annihilate any defenders who had survived the airstrike. But the Germans, the elite paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, survived. Deeply entrenched in reinforced cellars, caves, and defensive positions dug beneath the city and into the mountainside, they endured the cataclysm. Like iron worms, they waited for the storm to end. When the bombardment ceased and the Allied troops, led by the 2nd New Zealand Division and the 4th Indian Division, began to advance, they were met with precise, vicious, and merciless fire. The bombardment that should have destroyed the Germans actually created the perfect battlefield for them. War in the rubble, urban hell. New Zealand and Indian troops entered Cassino like ghosts walking through dust and smoke. They found no streets, only gigantic craters, mounds of rubble, twisted, rebar and fallen walls that formed a deadly maze. It was impossible to distinguish the ruins of a building from a German bunker. Every stone was a potential ambush, every shadow an enemy armed with an MG-42 machine gun or a sniper rifle. And so began what many veterans describe as the most brutal and intimate urban warfare on the Italian front. Allied soldiers had to conquer the terrain meter by meter. Their advance was measured in houses, rooms and bricks. Often, the fighting was so close that firearms were useless. Soldiers fought with bayonets, shovels, knives, and even their bare hands. So close, they could hear the heavy breathing of enemies hidden on the other side of a destroyed wall. The deaths were slow, personal, and horribly bloody. The now impassable streets became channels of mud, sewage from burst pipes, blood, and human remains. The Sherman tanks, which were supposed to provide support, became bogged down in craters or were destroyed by Panzerfausts, anti-tank, rocket launchers, fired from basements and broken windows. Communications were constantly failing, with wires cut by explosions and radios screaming for reinforcements and supplies that never arrived. As the battle raged in the city, Indian troops attempted an equally desperate attack on Hangman's Hill and Point 435, key positions providing access to the monastery ruins. High above, the rubble of the Abbey continued to spew machine gun and mortar fire onto the attackers, turning the slopes into a slaughterhouse. Failure and legacy. The New Zealanders, with superhuman bravery, managed to capture the train station and parts of downtown Cassino, but were unable to break through the German defenses surrounding the Hotel Continental and the Hotel des Roses, which had become fortresses. After days of fierce fighting and with casualties mounting at an unsustainable rate, the offensive was called off on March 23rd. Once again, the battle ended in failure. Thousands of deaths and injuries for the Allies, and nothing strategically gained. Monte Cassino remained unshaken, like an open wound in the landscape and in Allied morale, a wound that refused to heal. However, amid the carnage, the Allies were slowly learning the language of hell. They understood that brute force alone would not be enough. The next and final battle would require a new strategy, combining firepower, maneuver, and the courage of troops from even more nations, including the Poles, who would have a final, fateful encounter with the monastery ruins. Urban warfare in Cassino, the ghost town. After the massive bombardment of March 15th, Cassino was no longer a city. It was a labyrinth of death, an open-air cemetery where the streets had disappeared beneath tons of rubble and flooded craters. Every house was a trap, every pile of rubble a potential machine gun emplacement. The silence when it occurred was more terrifying than the noise, broken only by dry sniper fire, the whine of a ricochet, or the muffled screams of a wounded man. For the New Zealand, Indian, British, and South African soldiers ordered to take over this hellhole, Cassino became a faceless nightmare. They called it the ghost town. There were no civilians, no life, nothing resembling home. Only the dead, the dying, and the ghosts of those who had fallen. The combat in every room, a primal struggle. The war here was not fought on clear front lines, but in a three-dimensional space of chaos. Combat took place in every room, every basement, every floor. Soldiers fought their way not through the streets, but through holes blasted in walls with explosives, a tactic that became known as mouse-holing, opening rat holes. They went from house to house, breaking down doors with their rifle butts, only to be greeted by a burst of machine gun fire. The enemy, the German paratroopers, were masters at defending ruins. They transformed the destroyed city into a deadly spiderweb. Anti-personnel mines were hidden under mattresses or in the bodies of fallen soldiers. Grenades were attached to tripwires on doorknobs. Snipers, camouflaged by the dust and rubble, hid behind destroyed furniture or in holes in the ceiling. The enemy would appear out of nowhere, fire a short, precise burst, and disappear into the shadows. Eyes alone weren't enough. Instinct, the sound of a moving stone, or a sixth sense decided who lived and who died. Often soldiers slept where they fought, in the cold, damp rubble. They shared these makeshift shelters with the corpses of friends and enemies alike, for there was no time, no safety, and no place to bury them. The night brought no rest, only a different kind of terror. German artillery, guided by observers on the mountainside, was precise and relentless, turning the night into a spectacle of fire and shrapnel. The paratroopers defended Cassino as if it were Berlin. They fought to the last man, to the last bullet. Surrender was not an option in their code of honor. The death of tanks and sanity. The Sherman tanks, which were supposed to be the steel cavalry supporting the advancing infantry, became easy prey. Their tracks got stuck in the rubble. Their armor was punctured by anti-tank rockets. Panzerfaust fired from basements at close range. Many were transformed into metal torches, crematoriums for their crews. The infantrymen watched helplessly as their comrades burned alive, their screams drowned out by the roar of battle. The physical environment was as hostile as the enemy. A constant rain turned the dust into a thick, sticky mud that coated the feet and made every step difficult. Blood-soaked uniforms, and the air was so thick with cement dust, cordite fumes, and the stench of decay that many suffered from chronic coughs, respiratory infections, and mental breakdowns. Exhaustion, constant fear, and the constant vision of death corroded the mind. Sanity faded as the days passed, replaced by shock or savage rage. The Cassino had become a purgatory, a place where the living were beginning to doubt whether they were still among the living, moving like automatons in a cycle of do or die. A place where the only certainty was death, and the only hope was that it would be quick. And high above, omnipresent and mocking, the monastery. Its ruins, still in German hands, were the epicenter of the defense. It remained intact in its purpose, to deny the Allies the road to Rome. Time passed. The offensives failed. The dead piled up. The Allied commanders, faced with the failure of their brute force strategy, finally understood it was time to change everything. Progress stagnates. Months of static hell. After the carnage of the third battle, Allied momentum didn't just slow, it disintegrated. What followed wasn't a tactical pause, but a brutal paralysis. The advance simply ground to a halt, solidified into a landscape of devastation. There was no longer room for bold maneuvers, nor for a safe retreat. The Allied forces were exhausted, bled to physical and mental exhaustion. Morale, already tested to its limit, now teetered dangerously between grim resignation and utter despair. The battlefield became a static purgatory, a putrid mixture of mud, decaying bodies, rubble, and constant artillery fire. The war against the elements and hunger. As if the human enemy weren't enough, nature itself seemed to have turned against the Allies. The torrential rain of the Italian winter and early spring seemed endless. Cold and relentless, it transformed the already battered terrain into a treacherous, omnipresent quagmire. Soldiers' boots sank ankle-deep in an icy paste of earth and debris. Tanks, which were supposed to spearhead the attack, got stuck in flooded craters, becoming easy, static targets. Weapons, especially rifles and machine guns, constantly jammed in the mud and moisture, requiring frantic cleaning mid-fight. Logistics became a nightmare. The makeshift roads were rivers of mud, making the transport of vital supplies nearly impossible. Mules, the only vehicles capable of navigating some of the steepest trails, were constant targets of German artillery. As a result, food and ammunition rarely arrived on time or in sufficient quantities. Soldiers on the front line survived on cold rations, often for days on end, dreaming of a hot meal that never came. The lack of medical supplies was even more critical, turning treatable injuries into death sentences. Life in the trenches, a purgatory on earth. The trenches, once seen as temporary shelters, became permanent homes and potential graves. Soldiers lived, ate, slept, fought and died in that immense fetid network of holes dug in the earth, surrounded by coils of barbed wire and the wreckage of war. Life was a routine of misery. The trenches were constantly flooded with icy water mixed with sewage and human remains. Rats, fattened by the unburied corpses, infested the shelters. Diseases such as trench foot, dysentery and pneumonia spread like wildfire, incapacitating as many men as enemy bullets. The noise was incessant torture, a sound that never stopped, day or night. Allied artillery bombarded German positions, and German artillery responded with deadly precision. The whistling of mortars, nicknamed moaning minis by the Allies, it was a particularly feared sound, as it gave little warning before the devastating impact. This cruel soundtrack was the backdrop for men who no longer knew if they would see the next morning, living in a state of high alert that gnawed at the nerves to the edge of sanity. A stubborn enemy and a haunting symbol. The German enemy, the paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, proved to be one of the most formidable adversaries of the war. Experts in defense, they stood their ground and were determined. They knew every rock, every twisted tree, every hole in the landscape. They used the terrain as their primary weapon, channeling Allied attacks into pre-planned kill zones. Every attempt to advance, no matter how small, was met with a storm of crossfire from machine guns, mortars and artillery. Casualties mounted daily, not in major battles, but in a steady, demoralizing trickle of lives. Doctors and nurses at aid stations worked tirelessly in appalling conditions, performing surgeries in muddy tents by flashlight. But many wounded simply didn't stand a chance. Death became routine, and simply surviving another day was celebrated as a monumental victory. And high above, dominating the valley like a dark specter, the ruins of the monastery remained. The skeleton of the building, now a German fortress, was a constant reminder of Allied failure. It was the symbol of all that still needed to be conquered, a silent, arrogant defiance. Time passed excruciatingly slowly, but the war was relentless. The Allied commanders, faced with a bloody stalemate that threatened the future of the entire Italian campaign, knew something drastic had to be done. It was time for a new plan, one that could finally break through the static hell of Cassino and open once and for all the road to Rome. The strategy changes. Operation Diadem, the perfect storm. In the spring of 1944, as the last remnants of snow melted from the Apennine peaks and the bitter winter winds gave way to a fragile promise of renewal, a monumental transformation was underway behind the scenes of the Allied command. The period of static hell was over. The brute force strategy, focused on frontal and isolated attacks, which had repeatedly failed against the granite and steel wall of the Gustav Line, was abandoned. In its place was born a plan of unprecedented ambition and scale in the Italian campaign, Operation Diadem. This would be no ordinary battle. It would be an all-out offensive, a massive multilateral operation, the culmination of all the industrial and military might the Allies could muster in Italy. Under the strategic architecture of General Harold Alexander, Allied Commander-in-Chief, a truly international army was assembled. 20 divisions composed of British, American, Polish, French, including the feared Moroccan, Algerian and Tunisian colonial units, Canadian, New Zealand, South African and Indian troops were positioned to deliver the coup de grace. The logic of coordinated annihilation. The plan was, at its core, a masterpiece of strategic coordination, designed to exploit Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's only weakness, the lack of sufficient reserves to contain multiple simultaneous crises. Operation Diadem would attack along a 32-kilometer front, with 4 army corps advancing simultaneously. The British Hammer. On the left flank, the British 8th Army, under General Oliver Leese, would concentrate its main force in the Liris River Valley, the most direct route to Rome. Their mission was to break through the main defenses and advance like a steamroller. The French flank key. To their right, in the Ourense Mountains, General Alphonse Juin's French Expeditionary Corps would execute the most audacious maneuver. His troops, especially the Goumiers Moroccans, would ignore conventional routes and climb mountainous terrain deemed impassable by the Germans, outflanking the entire Gustav Line. The Polish dagger. In the eye of the storm, General Władysław Anders's 10 Polish Corps was given the most brutal and honorable task: the direct assault on the ruins of the Monte Cassino monastery and the surrounding mountain range. American pressure. Further west along the coast, General Mark Clark's American Fifth Army would exert relentless pressure, preventing the Germans from moving reinforcements into the critical Cassino sector. The offensive would be preceded by an artillery barrage of almost inconceivable magnitude. 2,000 guns of all calibers were meticulously positioned, wheel to wheel, ready to fire over 1 million shells in the first days of the battle. The Desert Tactical Air Force would fly thousands of sorties, bombing the German rear, destroying bridges, railways and supply depots to isolate the battlefield. It was the final and definitive chance to end the stalemate, forging human weapons. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, troops were withdrawn from the front lines for a period of intense training and re-equipment. The goal was to transform exhausted soldiers into lethal specialists. They practiced night raids, urban combat in replica villages, and mountain climbing techniques that mimicked the terrain of Cassino. Morale was carefully rebuilt. Hot meals, fresh uniforms, and letters from home were as important as ammunition. You Goumier Moroccans. In the mountains, the warriors of the Free French 3rd Infantry Division prepared for their special mission. Dressed in their djellabas, traditional striped robes, and armed with long knives, kumias, beyond their rifles, they were an otherworldly force. Their ability to move quickly and silently over impossible terrain, their superhuman endurance, and their ferocity in close combat made them the perfect weapon to unbalance the German defenses. The Poles and revenge. For the Polish II Corps, the mission was deeply personal. Composed of men who had survived Nazi prison camps and Soviet gulags, Their flag was adorned with the motto, "For our freedom and yours." General Anders, upon accepting the task of taking the monastery, told his troops, "Many of you will fall, but Poland will live forever in our hearts." For them, the Polish flag raised over the ruins of Monte Cassino would be a symbol of national resurrection. The mood was changing. The tension in the camps was electric. The soldiers cleaned their weapons for the last time, shared cigarettes in silence, and gazed at the mountains they would soon have to conquer. They prepared for what they knew would be the bloodiest and most decisive battle of their lives. And in the heart of the mountain, deep within the ruins that had become their fortress, the German paratroopers, veterans of 1,000 battles, felt the change in the air. They reinforced their positions, stocked up on ammunition, and waited. The silence before the storm was heavy with the weight of thousands of lives about to be extinguished. Monte Cassino awaited its final apocalypse. The attack of the WWII through the mountains, the key that unlocked hell, May 11th, 1944. On the dark, moonless night of May 11th, 1944, as 2,000 Allied guns opened fire in a deafening barrage along the Rapido River Valley, a different kind of war began in silence. Far from the noise and fury of the frontal assault, the men of the 4th Moroccan Mountain Division, part of the French Expeditionary Corps, launched one of the most audacious and decisive maneuvers of the entire Italian campaign. Their mission, conceived by the brilliant General Alphonse Juin, was seemingly impossible: to cross the Urunsi Mountains, a massif of rocky peaks and gorges that German strategists considered impenetrable, to attack the Gustav Line from behind. The warriors of the mountains, who were they, WWIIs? The protagonists of this feat were not conventional soldiers. They were the WWIIs, Berber tribal warriors from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. Led by French officers, they were a force in themselves. Wearing their djellabas, traditional striped cloaks, over their uniforms and turbans, and carrying the khom, a curved and deadly dagger, they looked like figures from another era. Their strength came not from heavy equipment, but from a lifetime spent in harsh, unforgiving terrain. They were masters of stealth, endurance, and survival, able to march for days with little food or water, move silently in total darkness, and scale slopes that would make a mountaineer hesitate. They were the perfect human weapon for the task at hand. The Germans, entrenched in their positions, expected tanks and infantry on the valley roads. They did not expect ghosts emerging from the mountain peaks. The silent march. Through the impossible, the march began under cover of darkness. Carrying their mortars, machine guns, and ammunition on their backs, the WWII, they braved the icy mud and the biting cold of the mountain night. The terrain was their first enemy. They climbed goat trails, over loose rocks that threatened to betray their position, and precipices that challenged death with every step. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of the wind and the men's labored breathing. Their movements were coordinated, almost instinctive, an invisible army flowing like water over rock, advancing toward the heart of hell. They didn't follow a path, they created one. Where there was no path, they climbed. Where there was a cliff, they found a crevice. Their determination was greater than any natural obstacle, the bloody awakening and the total surprise. At dawn, when the first rays of sunlight illuminated the peaks, the WWII, they fell upon the German positions like an avalanche. The surprise was total and devastating. The troops of the German 71st Infantry Division, accustomed to repelling bloody frontal attacks in the valley below, suddenly found themselves attacked from above and behind. Moroccan warriors appeared from where they shouldn't have been, shouting and shooting. The ensuing fighting was fierce, primitive, and bloody. It was hand-to-hand combat, fought on narrow ridges and steep slopes. Rifle fire, machine gun fire, the dry boom of grenades and knife thrusts echoed across. The mountains, WWII, they displayed unrelenting courage and ferocity that shocked the German veterans. They did not back down. They pressed the attack, taking hill after hill, bunker after bunker, breaking the backbone of the German mountain defenses. This flanking attack was the turning point. It not only opened crucial gaps in the Gustav Line, but also forced Kesselring to divert his precious reserves, including elite units, to try to contain this new and unexpected threat. This relieved the pressure on the British in the Liris Valley, and crucially, on the Poles, preparing for the assault on the monastery. As the fighting around the monastery and in the town of Cassino continued with brutal intensity, the Moroccans' actions signaled that the tide had irrevocably changed. The seemingly impenetrable terrain, the natural fortress that had ensured the Gustav Line's security, was giving way. Monte Cassino, the bastion that had withstood months of bombardment and frontal assaults, was finally being besieged, not by brute force, but by the quiet audacity of mountain warriors. The key that would unlock the path to Rome had been turned. The Polish attack on the monastery, blood, honor, and the red and white flag, May 11th, 18th, 1944. On the night of May 11th, while the WWII infiltrated the mountains and British artillery opened the gates of hell in the Liris Valley, the men of the Polish II Corps, under the command of General Władysław Anders, began their own ordeal. Theirs was the most feared and perhaps the noblest task of the entire operation, the frontal assault on the German positions on Ghost Hill, Mount Calvary, and finally, the ruins of the monastery of Monte Cassino itself. The weight of history rested on their shoulders. They knew that the fate of Rome, and in a sense of the Italian campaign itself, hinged on that moment and that place. A battle for the soul of Poland. To understand the ferocity of the Polish attack, one must understand who these men were. They weren't just soldiers, they were the embodiment of a crucified nation. Many were veterans of the 1939 invasion, men who had been captured by the Soviets and survived the horrors of the Siberian gulags. Freed after Germany's invasion of the USSR, they formed an army in exile, marching through Iran, Iraq, and Palestine, always with one goal: to fight the Germans who had destroyed their country. For them, this was not a battle for foreign territory. It was a personal battle, a direct confrontation against the tyranny that had murdered their families, burned their cities, and attempted to erase their culture. Each German paratrooper entrenched in the ruins was a symbol of the enemy they had sworn to defeat. Victory here would not be merely tactical, it would be a moral resurrection. The first assault, a baptism of fire and death. The first attack on May 12th was a bloody disaster. The Poles advanced with desperate courage, but were met by an inferno of fire. The German paratroopers, masters of defense, had turned every rock and crater into a machine gun nest. The terrain, a chaos of sharp rocks, twisted rebar, and bomb craters, funneled the attackers into minefields and pre-planned kill zones. The fighting was intense, almost suicidal. Polish soldiers advanced slowly, crouching among the ruins, only to be mown down by bursts of MG-42 fire. The German artillery, precise and relentless, turned the hillsides into a slaughterhouse. In 48 hours, the Polish II Corps lost nearly 4,000 men, a third of its fighting strength. Wounded and bleeding, General Anders was forced to order a retreat. The first round had been a devastating defeat. Victory through exhaustion, the final assault. For days, the Poles licked their wounds, regrouped, and prepared to try again. Their resolve had not been broken, it had been forged into steel by pain. Meanwhile, the success of the Gumius in the flanks and the British advance down the valley began to strangle the German garrison. Their supply lines were cut. The pressure was unbearable. Kesselring, realizing the position was untenable, gave the reluctant order for his paratroopers to withdraw during the night of May 17th. On the morning of May 18th, 1944, the Poles launched their final attack. They advanced cautiously, expecting the same fierce resistance, but the silence that greeted them was eerie. The German machine guns were silent. Cautiously, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Lancers Regiment entered the monastery. Ruins. They found no fighting garrison, but an eerie silence broken only by the groans of the German wounded left behind. The fortress had fallen, not to a final blow, but to exhaustion. and encirclement. At 10:20 a.m., the white and red Polish flag was hoisted over the rubble alongside the British Union Jack. A Polish bugler played the St. Mary's bugle call, a traditional Krakow bugle call that, according to legend, ends abruptly to commemorate a bugler killed by an enemy arrow. The melancholy and triumphant sound echoed through the valley, a requiem for the dead and an announcement to the world. It was a terribly bitter victory. The destruction was total. The bodies of Poles and Germans lay piled among the sacred stones. Extreme exhaustion was visible on the faces of every survivor, but the victory meant that the Gustav Line was irretrievably broken. The passage to Rome was finally open. The Poles had accomplished their mission. Their sacrifice, engraved in the stones of Monte Cassino and in the war cemetery that now stands on its slopes, would forever be remembered as one of the most courageous and moving acts of World War II. The fall of Cassino and the march on Rome, the end of Calvary and the controversial glory. The Polish flag waving over the smouldering ruins of the monastery on May 18, 1944, was not just a symbol of victory. It was the sound of the backbone of the Gustav Line breaking, with the monastery fortress neutralized and the Gumiers with the Moroccans wreaking havoc on their flanks. The previously impregnable German position became a death trap. From that moment on, the German resistance, once so fierce and stubborn, began to crumble like a house of cards. The rupture and the persecution. The German forces, exhausted by months of incessant fighting, their supply lines cut, and no hope of reinforcements, had no choice. Field Marshal Kesselring ordered a general, orderly retreat to the next defensive line, the Hitler Line, later renamed the Senger Line, several kilometers to the north. What had been a static, impenetrable defense turned into a desperate retreat. For the Allied soldiers in the valley, the change was seismic. The enemy fire that had tormented them for months lessened, then fell silent. Cautiously, and then with increasing urgency, they advanced. The Allied army seized the breach with astonishing speed. Tanks, jeeps, and infantry columns advanced along Route 6, the legendary road to Rome. What had been a hell of craters, mud, and death, for 4 long months became an open road. The dust kicked up by the Allied convoys replaced the smoke of explosives. The race to Rome and the Clark controversy. With the Gustav Line breached, General Alexander's original plan was for the American Fifth Army to turn inland to encircle and annihilate the retreating German 10th Army, a move that could have destroyed the core of German forces in Italy. However, General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, made a decision that would become one of the most controversial of the campaign. Obsessed with the glory of being the liberator of Rome, Clark ignored Alexander's orders. Instead of executing the encirclement maneuver, he redirected most of his forces directly north, in a mad dash for the capital. This decision allowed most of the German 10th Army to escape the noose, prolonging the war in Italy for nearly another year of bloody fighting. On June 4, 1944, American troops entered Rome. The Eternal City declared. An open city was liberated without major fighting. The reception was euphoric. Crowds of jubilant Italians took to the streets, hailing the Allied soldiers as liberators, offering wine, flowers, and hugs. For many, this victory, the first Axis capital to fall, symbolized the beginning of the end of Nazi tyranny in Europe. The news echoed around the world, a beacon of hope. However, this celebration was overshadowed just 2 days later, on June 6th, when the world's attention turned north to the massive landings in Normandy, D-Day, the bitter price of victory. The joy in Rome contrasted sharply with the grim reality left behind at Cassino. The price of victory was astronomical. The 4-month campaign to break through the Gustav Line cost the Allies over 105,000 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing. German losses, though smaller, were also devastating, especially among their elite units. The surrounding towns and villages had been completely destroyed, turned into ghost towns, and the Monastery, once a beacon of faith, culture, and peaceful resistance for 1400 years, had become a silent and broken monument, a testament to the pain, sacrifice, and futility of war. But the fall of Monte Cassino was decisive. It opened a vital path that, despite controversy, led to the liberation of Rome and contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in Italy. The unwavering courage of the soldiers, British, American, New Zealand, Indian, French, Moroccan, Algerian, Polish, and so many others, marked one of the bloodiest and most heroic pages of World War II. Their story is an eternal reminder that even in the darkest and most hellish battles, human determination, sacrifice, and camaraderie can, in the end, conquer hell. The Battle of Monte Cassino was not just a military engagement, it was a symbol of human pain, courage, and sacrifice amid the brutality of World War II. More than 100,000 Allied and German soldiers lost their lives on that terrain of stone and mud. Lives that were taken by difficult decisions, ruthless strategies, and a merciless war. Monte Cassino showed the cost of war in its rawest form. Not only men, but cities, heritage, cultures, and beliefs were destroyed. The monastery, rebuilt after the war, is now a living memorial, a place to remember that faith and history can withstand even the darkest horrors, but that peace is always the greatest challenge to be achieved. And the memory of the soldiers, of the Moroccans who braved cliffs, of the Poles who fought to the end, of the Americans who braved bloody rivers, of the British and New Zealanders who bore the brunt of the battle, remains alive. Monte Cassino is the story of a hell in the Italian mountains, a saga of courage and suffering that resonates to this day. A battle that taught the world the true price of freedom. The Battle of Monte Cassino was much more than a military confrontation. It was a brutal test of the courage, endurance, and humanity of thousands of men. Amid mud, fire, and ruins, soldiers from different nations fought and died to pave the way for freedom in Italy. The price was too high, but the victory, though bitter, showed that even in the darkest moments, human determination can prevail. May this story be a reminder of the cost of war and the value of peace, so that we never forget the sacrifices made on that immortal mountain.